I have to say I feel a little embarrassed sitting here for two reasons. The first reason is that I was very bad at science in school, and so I probably shouldn't be at a conference on science for peace, but thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and the second reason I am embarrassed is that I must speak in English, for which my apologies. I'd like to congratulate Stefano and his colleagues on this excellent report. I had a chance to read it last night, and it is a first-class contribution to the discussion of Europe's military role and civilian role in crisis management. I would say it's a very European report.
It's a very
European report. And I mean that in a positive way, but maybe also in a slightly negative way. It's very positive because it is a genuinely European approach to the problem of creating a single army. It's not an Italian approach. It is one that will resonate, I think, in all 27 members of the European Union. But it's European in a slightly negative way too, and let me explain that. Why is it European? Well, let's look at the title. It focuses on institutions and capabilities in the making. It doesn't mention action. And this is a constant problem in debates about European security, which is that we focus on institutions and building up institutions and oversight, but we don't focus on action, what actually happens in crisis zones. And while we have been developing institutions for crisis management over the last decade, actually our engagement in real crises may be in decline. If we'd been sitting here in 2006, we would have been talking about the huge European deployment to Lebanon to end the war between Hezbollah and Israel. And we would have been celebrating the fact that Italy played a central role in that deployment. But we would also be talking about the Congo, because in 2006 there was a European Union mission in Congo. We would be talking about Bosnia, where there were still thousands of European troops. We would be talking about Kosovo. The EU was preparing a justice mission for Kosovo back in 2006. We would be talking about Chad, because in 2006 the EU was already planning a humanitarian mission to Chad. We would also, of course, have been talking about Afghanistan, where European troops were growing in numbers at that time. Today, if we look around, the number of European soldiers in Lebanon is declining. The EU has left Chad after being there for a single year in a mission that didn't do very much. There are only 2,000 European troops left in Bosnia. We failed the test of Kyrgyzstan this summer. We couldn't even send a small European police mission to Kyrgyzstan. And we are getting ready to retreat from Afghanistan. Europe is in retreat on many different fronts. And this worries me because if we want a European peace army, yes, you need institutions, yes, you need capabilities, but the basis of this army must be actions in the field. And after the political horror of Afghanistan, during the economic horror of the financial crisis, Europeans are backing away from these global deployments. And I worry about that, because you can have all the institutions you like, but if you don't have the political will to deploy fast to Lebanon, as we did in 2006, then the institutions don't matter. So that's one reason that this is European. Now, of course, I'm not saying that we shouldn't worry about institutions. You need strong institutions to make action possible. But I just want to emphasize that we must think about the reality of operations as well as formal institutions. The second reason that this is a European report is because it lays out many of the problems that the EU faces very well, but it doesn't tell us very much about what other major global powers are doing in military terms. We've talked over the last day and a half about the fact that European governments are cutting defence spending by huge amounts. The British government, my government, I guess, although I live in the US, has made defence cuts unparalleled in its recent history. Germany is going in the same direction, so is Spain. And you can look at that and you can think, oh good, we are heading to a more peaceful world. But then you look beyond Europe and you see India buying 125 new fighter aircraft. You see a defense deal between Saudi Arabia and the US worth $60 billion. You look at Brazil, a very, very peaceful country, a country that rejects the use of force. How much did Brazil expand its defense budget last year? 25%. A 25% growth in its defense budget in a single year, and that will continue. All around the world, new economic powers are emerging, and they are simultaneously expanding their defense capacities hugely. And so as Europe steps back from defense, we see other powers expanding their military role, China obviously also in Asia. And we have to be very careful as we plan our own military future in looking around the world and understanding the international environment in which our militaries will play a role. One piece of good news, let me add, is that in Africa you do see military spending declining, and this is very positive, I think, in most regards. That is one region where there is some stepping back from militarism. But in Asia, in Latin America, the world is becoming more militaristic. Now, that worries me, but it does have one positive dimension. And I learnt that positive dimension on a trip to Haiti before the earthquake, 3 or 4 years ago. Because Haiti, a desperately poor country, a desperately unstable country, has been stabilized by Brazilian troops under the UN flag. And I've visited many European Union missions, and I've always been impressed by the soldiers there and the civilians there. But the most impressive soldiers I've ever met were those Brazilians in downtown Port-au-Prince, in the slums of Port-au-Prince. I went deep into the slums, and I actually went to a Brazilian base. And I'll tell you this anecdote, because the Brazilians had 8 armored cars. They had what was essentially a fortress with 50 soldiers constantly on guard, fighting the gangs that were terrorizing the poor Haitians in Port-au-Prince. Across the road from that Brazilian fortress was a playground that had been funded by the European Commission. And it had a lovely sign, and it had the EU flag on it, and it was very pretty. But that, I think, is a symbol for what may be the future of peace and stability operations. The Europeans will build playgrounds, but it will be the Brazilians and the Chinese and the Indians who do the hard military work of stabilizing countries. And I worry about that future. I worry because I think that Emma is absolutely right. Europe cannot leave global security to other powers. We should be delighted that Brazil and India are heavily involved in UN peacekeeping, but we should contribute too, because we have huge responsibilities to countries like Côte d'Ivoire or Congo. Why do we have those responsibilities? We created those countries and we messed them up, frankly, in the last century. And we cannot turn our back on those countries while they continue to be unstable and they continue to be... You didn't mess up those countries. You messed up Somalia, and I'll come back to Somalia, but that's another story. We cannot turn our back on that. And if we want to have a serious voice in the UN Security Council, perhaps one day we'll even have an EU seat in the Security Council, but if we want to have a serious voice at the UN, if we want to have a serious voice in Washington, if we want to have a serious voice in Beijing and Delhi and Brasilia and the new centers of power in a multipolar world, we have to be prepared to take our part of the burden of security and defense. So for all those reasons, I massively welcome this report. And I recognize that there are huge domestic political challenges to the project I'm describing. And that for the near future, it is very unlikely that we are going to even maintain current defense spending levels. And I think there are many projects, as Professor Veronese said, which can be cut because they do not contribute to global stability. There are many, many redundant military assets in Europe. Finland has more artillery pieces than any other country in Europe, waiting to bombard the Russians as the Russians invade Finland. Those aren't necessary, I hope. We can, we can get rid of some of those assets and move the money into more useful logistical assets, such as those Stefano was describing. But because we do face real financial constraints, I think that it's absolutely right, as again Stefano suggested and Emma suggested, that we put more money into civilian capabilities, judges, policemen. The EU has one big police mission today in Kosovo. Getting the judges for that mission, getting the police for that mission was incredibly difficult. Even more difficult, in fact, has been staffing a much smaller police mission that sits in Afghanistan. This was launched, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, and a goal was set of, I think, maybe 300 policemen? I forget the number. More or less that. It took 2.5 years to find all those policemen. In that time, the situation in Afghanistan has deteriorated. And this year, the US said, we've had enough of this EU mission. We are going to take over the police training through NATO because, quite frankly, the EU can't do this, which is horribly embarrassing.
No, it's also a different mission.
Well, this is a debate, but frankly, the EU has not succeeded in this mission in Afghanistan. So we need to find ways, as Emma was describing, of finding more judges, more policemen. One thing that your report doesn't touch on is mediators, political mediators. And I think that this is actually something we should think about more too. Mediation is an incredibly complex skill, bringing together the various factions in Darfur, or maybe finding a way to talk to the Taliban. To do that, you need civilians with very, very special skills, and those civilians are very rare, trained mediators. And the UN has a special mediation team, but the EU does not have a special mediation team. And I think that's a bad mistake on the EU's part. One good bit of news is that the European Parliament has laid aside €1 million this year to start funding mediation training by the new European External Action Service. And I really hope we'll see more money invested in mediation in the near future, because mediators also can go in very early. They can engage in a crisis when it's at its earliest stage, before you need troops or you need police. And in conflict, as in medicine, prevention is better than a cure. And skilled civilian mediators are both cheaper, more effective, and faster moving than troops. And so I hope that the EU will invest in civilian mediation. Finally, though, we have to admit that while we can do all the mediation we like, while we can do all the civilian justice building that we like, there will be cases where a military dimension to peace operations is unavoidable. And I mentioned Somalia. I note that in this report, one of the authors, Gerard Quill, emphasizes that the EU now has a comprehensive approach to Somalia that involves not only anti-piracy operations off its coast, but also a commitment to build up gender rights and justice and human rights and the rule of law in Somalia, on the land. How on earth can we do that if, as today, Somalia is in total chaos? There is a small African Union peacekeeping force in Mogadishu. It has been fighting a 2-month battle with Islamist militia groups in Mogadishu. And we talk about building up human rights. How can you build respect for human rights when there is open warfare on the streets? You cannot. There are times when an effective military presence is necessary to build up security. In many cases, it's just a deterrent. But in some cases, it has to be used. And I will end by identifying one case where force was used in a very precise way and had a very good effect, because in one of the brochures for this conference, there is a picture from Bosnia in the 1990s, and it's of a group of Serb militiamen, the Tigers, Arkan's Tigers. They were a terrifying militia group, and it's a picture of them murdering 3 Bosnian civilians. Well, in 1997, Arkan's Tigers were still in action in Croatia, and the UN surrounded them with soldiers and surrounded them with helicopters, and they surrendered and they disappeared. And there are times when you need force to do that, like it or not. And so the EU needs civilians, it needs mediators, but it still needs troops if it's going to count in building world peace.
Thank you.